Hey samplers, it's Katherine Grant, your host. I'm still on summer vacation for this final week of July, so let's celebrate with one last story roundup. This finishes up our roundup of Regency romances sampled so far on the podcast. Keep listening for samples from Isabella Kamal, Rebecca Paula, Tabetha Waite, Bianca Blythe, Cecilia Rene, Maggie Sims, and another one from yours truly. I will be back next week with a new episode with Elizabeth Everett. Until then, happy listening. The Temple of Persephone by Isabella Kamal. I know you're reading for us from your debut, The Temple of Persephone.
Yes.
Is there anything about the story or the scene that we should know before you jump into it?
Yes. So our heroine, Persephone Honeyfield, has just broken into Gallows Gate, which she believes to be abandoned, but is actually the estate of our hero, and he has just caught her there. So that's pretty much all we need to know.
Awesome.
Okay. So this is chapter 5 for anyone who's curious. Aidan had been sulking in the gallery when a noisy creak resounded through the house, followed by the sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway into the library. He had assumed it was Baker, accidentally bringing the tea tray to the wrong room. That was what he had expected to find, at least. What he hadn't expected was to see a woman at the top of the ladder that leaned against the shelves, reaching for a book. He also hadn't expected said book to be dropped right onto his head, but that was his fault for quietly approaching before announcing himself. Bending down, he picked the large volume up off the floor. The words mythology of ancient Greece were pressed into the dark green leather in intricate silver lettering. He turned to the woman, finally able to get a good look at her. The words that had been ready to leave his mouth were quickly lost as he took in the sight of her, hanging onto the rungs of the ladder and staring at him with brown eyes the size of saucers. She looked like a little forest nymph, clad in a white dress that appeared a little worse for wear. The hem was muddied, and parts of it were torn to pieces. His eyes slid up to her hair, so short that it may as well have been fashioned after a man's. It stuck out haphazardly in every direction, revealing a high forehead. The light that filtered through the window illuminated her, making her hair shine in shades of golden honey, and her skin glow with freckles that appeared to be composed entirely of sunlight. She stared down at him, eyes curious. The silence stretched on, an unreadable expression on her face. She remained high above him, knuckles white from her grip on the ladder. "I'm very sorry," she squeaked, making no move to descend. "Whatever for?" he replied, despite knowing that she was technically trespassing on his property and therefore did owe him an apology. She raised an eyebrow. "For dropping the book on your head?" He looked down at the book and then back at her. Of course. She was no conventional beauty, yet he was sure he'd never come across a more bewitching creature. "What does the cover say?" she demanded, squinting at the book he held in his hands. "Mythology of ancient Greece," he replied. She sighed. "That's not right." "It isn't?" She scaled down a few rungs and wedged herself against the ladder, making a seat out of it. Up close, he saw that everything about her was small, down to her delicate, slender fingers. She reached for the book with one hand, the back of which was dusted with freckles. Aidan wasn't quite sure how to put a name to the emotion coursing through him. Curiosity, confusion, or, and thinking this almost had him wincing outwardly in embarrassment, was it attraction? How long had it been since he'd been alone with a woman? "My name is Persephone," she said. Of course it was. He was hallucinating the physical embodiment of a goddess staring down at him with large, questioning eyes. He continued to study her small face, her slender neck, the unbearably luscious swell of her bosom, "And yours?" He lifted his eyes back to her face. "I beg your pardon? Your name?" "My apologies," he said quickly. He gave an awkward bow. "Aidan Barrington." "But you aren't supposed to be here," she said slowly, a frown marring her delicate features. "Aren't I? Gallowsgate belongs to my family," he said, feeling equal parts dazed and confused. Her dark eyebrows shot up. "Yes, but you don't live here, do you?" "No," he corrected quickly. "I live in London. I'm just visiting." "Oh," she exhaled, her shoulders relaxing. "I wouldn't have climbed into the window had I known anyone was here. Everyone in the village said this place was abandoned." "It is," he told her. "Well, partially, but what are you doing here?" This was his house, after all. The idea that any number of people might have climbed through the window over the last decade and gone through what was left of his family's possessions brought a twinge of discomfort and the urge to guard Gallowsgate from prying eyes. With Baker as its only guardian, Gallowsgate may very well have become an easy target for anyone curious to know what remained within its walls. Granted, the woman before him did not exactly give the impression of a thief, and if she was not a very good one. Persephone gave him a blank stare. "I'm looking for a book," I gathered, he said wryly. "Why here? It's not often people go looking for books in abandoned houses. I have reason to believe what I'm looking for is here. I did not choose a random house to search through, I'll have you know." "No, of course not," he murmured, struck by the oddness of the exchange. "What book are you after exactly? Perhaps I can help." It was a ridiculous thing to say, given that he hadn't been to Gallowsgate in years and had absolutely no clue what books the library even held. "It's called Mythology of the Greeks and Romans," she said. "And Mythology of Ancient Greece won't suffice?" "No, it won't," she paused. "It'll have the same stories, I'm sure, but it isn't what I'm looking for." He looked up at her. "Do the mortals tell your tale correctly in books, Persephone?" She hesitated, and he wondered if he'd overstepped. God, he was rusty. "No," she replied, "I'm afraid they do not." "Is that so?" "For one, I was not dragged into the underworld kicking and screaming," she said mildly. He gave her a curious look. Persephone lifted her chin. "I went of my own volition, and I was not tricked into eating those pomegranate seeds. I asked to have them." He chuckled. "You wish to remain in the underworld?" She nodded. "The underworld needed a queen, and I needed a change from the monotony of spring." "How fortunate for Hades that he was able to capture your heart." Color crept across her cheeks, and Aidan felt a thrill at having caused her to blush. That she had broken into Gallowsgate was already forgotten. "I'm not quite sure he has, though I am certain I've captured his," she replied, eyes glittering mischievously before shifting back to the shelves that lined the wall. "Would you help me? Find the book, I mean." "Of course," he said, a touch too quickly. "It belongs to my family," she blurted out, pushing Mythology of Ancient Greece back into its proper place. "I'm not looking to steal anything from you." "You'd be welcome to it either way," he said, hoping he sounded polite instead of desperately foolish. "I'm not really one for books." "That's a shame," she said, looking down at him. "Perhaps you ought to try something new." It was not what she was referring to, but he had the distinct feeling that his something new was staring right at him. "What would you recommend?" "Depends on what you've already read," she said, eyes scanning the room, "and it depends on what you've enjoyed. You'll have to think on it." He was enjoying this. He hadn't enjoyed something so much in the 10 years since he'd taken on his father's business. Who knew that running into a strange wisp of a woman in his library would be just the thing to bring him back to life? Suddenly intent on pleasing her, Aidan began to look through the shelves, hunting for the book she was so desperate to find. They searched in perfect silence, occasionally checking in with one another until Persephone let out a long, exasperated sigh from the ladder, which now sat 2 bookshelves down from where it had originally been propped. "Where is it?" she grumbled. "I doubt I'll get back before Venus and Papa now." "Back?" "To Honeyfield," she explained. "I live there with my sister and father." Honeyfield. When Ezra first mentioned it, it was as if Aidan had never heard the name at all. It had been so long since he thought of Oxbury at large. The only part that had lived on in his mind was Gallowsgate, isolated and oppressive. Nothing else had existed in his memories, mostly because nothing else had really mattered. His father had not allowed them to mix with the other families beyond going to the village, though a part of him vaguely recalled his mother receiving visitors while Charles had been away. Perhaps someone from Honeyfield. How else would the book have found its way here? The only thing he was certain of was that he and Persephone had never met. He would have remembered her. "The honey," he murmured. "My friend Ezra's at Honeyfield." "Oh," she gasped, "you know Mr. Haskett." "We came here together." "Why aren't you at Honeyfield then?" she asked. "Surely you've come for the same reason as Mr. Haskett." "Not quite," he said. "Only Ezra is here for honey. I'm here for a change of scenery." She nodded as if all had been clarified. "I see. Well, I really should return. If you don't mind, I'll come back another time to look for the book, or you could let me know if you come across it. I doubt you'd want me back here tracking mud on your floors." He frowned. What could he do to keep her from leaving so soon? "Stay for tea," he blurted out. "I shouldn't," she said quietly, making her way down the ladder. He quickly approached her and offered his hand. She hesitated for a moment before slipping her delicate hand in his. Pure electricity shot through him at the contact, the force of it dizzyingly delicious. She had to have felt it too. What were the odds of their meeting? What were the odds of it being so perfect? Free from the wandering eyes of society, free from propriety, free from the presence of nosy gossips. Perfect didn't even begin to do it justice. At that moment, Persephone's boot caught the torn hem of her muddied white dress. A loud tearing sound cut through the room, and in less than a second, she had toppled off the ladder and straight into his arms, a large chunk of white muslin hanging pathetically onto the rest of her dress by a thread. He could feel the warmth of her, one hand against her back, the other having found purchase underneath her now bare knees. She blinked at him, cheeks crimson, the force of her heartbeat apparent even to him. I am so, she began, voice hoarse. Are you, he said precisely at the same time. Neither of them could complete their thoughts because, without any warning, Ezra burst into the room. He was accompanied by a tall elderly gentleman, a young woman with blonde curls, and a middle-aged couple who looked absolutely stricken. Oh, no, Persephone whispered, barely audible. She wiggled in his arms. Put me down. Aiden snapped out of his daze and slowly lowered her to the ground, clearing his throat. Ezra, I wasn't expecting you back so soon. I can see that, Ezra said cheerfully. Aiden shot him a look that made the smile disappear off Ezra's face. Everyone was curious to see Gallows Gate, Ezra explained. I thought we could have tea here before returning to Honeyfield for the rest of the demonstration. And it seems we arrived at the perfect moment, the middle-aged woman said, her horror seemingly forgotten as she began to practically vibrate with glee. There was no perfect moment, Mrs. Harding, Persephone corrected sharply. A lover's rendezvous, Mrs. Harding said in a loud stage whisper to the man next to her. Persephone, the blonde woman cried out, hands flying to her mouth. I was just, Persephone sighed in exasperation. I came here to look for the book, Venus. Venus's attention turned to Aiden, eyes widening as she examined him. Did you find it? No, Persephone said. In fact, I was about to return home. Such scandal, Mrs. Harding crowed, and in Oxbury too, and to have Miss Honeyfield in the center of it is simply, there is no scandal, Persephone protested. She looked up at Aiden pleadingly. Tell them there is no scandal. Miss Honeyfield is correct, he said, stepping forward. I was only assisting in her search for a book. Alone, Mr. Barrington? Mrs. Harding asked. It seemed he could not be free of gossips, not even in Oxbury. So much for the perfection of their encounter. Mr. Barrington, Venus said slowly, as if testing his name out. Aiden Barrington? Aren't you the Lord of the Dead? Excuse me, Persephone said, putting her hands on her hips. Aiden let out a long exhale, dread barreling through him. So he is, Mrs. Harding exclaimed. We heard all about it from Mrs. Murphy when she returned from London. Right, Persephone interrupted. I think we have taken far too much of Mr. Barrington's time already. We have not, however, been given sufficient explanation as to your activities here, Mrs. Harding insisted. Look at her dress. The poor thing's almost had it torn right off her. This time, Aiden saw that even Venus was casting a look of utter astonishment at the older woman. Mrs. Harding was hell-bent on conjuring a scandal out of this particular misunderstanding, and there was nothing anybody could do to stop her. Such an unfortunate situation your daughter has found herself in, Mr. Honeyfield, and with the Lord of the Dead, no less, Mrs. Harding continued with clearly feigned sympathy. Thank goodness your dear wife is not here to see this. Her eldest daughter ruined, she simply would not have been able to cope. Mrs. Harding, Venus chastised, do not think you are unaffected by this, my dear, Mrs. Harding said, beady eyes darting to Venus. What gentleman would willingly marry into a family stained by such impropriety? Oh, what a waste of your beauty. The entire village was quite convinced you'd be the one to marry well. Surely you did not foresee being forced to remain at Honeyfield for the rest of your days with your ruined sister in tow. I shudder to think what will become of the two of you now. Venus's cheeks flushed crimson. I think we'll... Papa, Persephone interjected desperately, turning toward the thin man who had thus far been silent. There is no scandal to speak of, Mrs. Harding, Mr. Honeyfield said, his words measured and slow. This was not the way we wished to announce the news, but my daughter and Mr. Barrington are... He paused here as the entire room awaited his final word. Engaged. Aiden's mouth dropped open just as Persephone let an entirely unladylike curse slip from her lips. Ezra, meanwhile, gave Aiden a smug smile. And you said there was nothing to be found in Oxbury.
In Want of a Wife by Rebecca Paula.
Rafe set the cat down and turned his attention back toward Lily, who was gazing through her telescope and taking notes. She lived for the stars as much as he lived for the sea, and he couldn't look away as the fireflies darted in the long grass. The sweet fragrance of moonflowers by the door flooded his senses, and he longed for a good cigar. He longed to touch her more, and to kiss her. That's all he could think of when they were sailing earlier. The wind had tossed her hair about, and that beautiful full smile of hers was nearly as bright as the late June sun. She hadn't sat by either, but asked for him to teach her to sail, so he had. They had spent hours out on the ocean together before the sun dropped heavy and orange in the sky, and it was time to return for dinner, and he still wished to kiss her. Are you ever going to come outside? She called to him at last, or do you plan only on keeping watch? He laughed in spite of himself. He would miss her when he left, and he had to leave. But until then, they could share what little they could, right? Was it wrong to kiss? Was it only going to be one? But what happens when one kiss is not enough? That way led to trouble, but he gathered he had heaped it upon himself the moment he had read her letter. She needed a husband, but he could never be that for her, especially when Henry didn't have a wife. Rafe would only disappoint Lily. She needed a stable, honest husband. He knew he should have said goodnight and left, knew as he stepped out of the cottage and walked toward her, knew it as he approached, and she looked up from the telescope and flashed a smile in his direction that made him forget his name. Trouble. Are you looking for something? He asked, stopping short of touching her. Aren't we all? I mean, in that, and he pointed toward the telescope. Oh, yes, I'm looking for. Oh, wait, do you truly wish to know? I don't want to bore you. You never bore me, Lily. You say that now, but given enough time. And he sighed, then chuckled. What are you studying up in the sky this evening? Well, it was documented in England's star catalogue that several stars were part of a constellation, but they were marked incorrectly, and I'm sure of it. I've been charting them over the past several months to cross-reference them before I write a letter to the Royal Society. Can I see? Of course. She steps aside, waving her arm for him to move forward. She was gorgeous and perfect and utterly brilliant. Whether she believed him or not, he could listen to her talk about the stars forever. And he gazed into the telescope, scanning the night sky. It was remarkable. He navigated ships by these same stars for years, but he never knew they would lead him to Lily. If you look to the right, Lily said, her voice a warm whisper by his ear, that's the cluster of stars. A few were never documented, and others charted incorrectly. Rafe turned his head to meet her brown eyes, gazing at him in anticipation. You love the stars, Lily. I love that about you. Even in the pale light of the full moon, he saw the flush gather on her cheeks. People fall in love with the stars, but they're foolish to do so. It's thought they're dead, you see. Astronomers have noticed stars are fickle. Some fade and others suddenly shine bright. That's because they think we see from Earth as a memory of light. We fall in love with that, with a memory, as if our hearts need the extra burden of being tricked by the heavens as well as in love.
A Duke, Love, and Sunshine by Tabetha Waite.
If you keep pacing like that, you're bound to wear a path through the floor. Iona stopped and glanced at Miss Stratford, who was sitting in the parlor and working on some needlepoint. Her faded red hair was pulled back into a tidy bun, her clothes of the highest fashion, but it was those sharp green eyes that seemed to see more than Iona might wish that were unnerving. She tried not to fidget as she sat on the edge of the settee. I'm sorry, Miss Stratford. I suppose I'm a bit restless. Naturally, she murmured. You're going to be with a handsome duke all day. No doubt the butterflies in your stomach are being quite contrary. Iona barely withheld a groan. What if I make a misstep? I'm not concerned about that at all, the lady waved a dismissive hand. You were raised properly in a good household, and Agatha will be acting as your chaperone for the day. I have no fear that all will be well. Iona exhaled steadily. She wished she might be able to say the same. For some reason, seeing the Duke every day was not nearly as bothersome when she was wearing her plain attire because it reminded her of the difference in their stations. However, wearing a soft, light blue gown sparked the memory of a former life, one she would rather leave behind. Nevertheless, Rosewood was her employer, and if he asked her to accompany him, it was difficult to refuse for fear he would dismiss her completely. It wouldn't be so bad if she didn't think about him continuously, if her journal wasn't starting to fill with several entries about him each night. She had told herself that any sort of fascination she might have held toward him had faded when he'd taken off to London for a few days, but it seemed as if absence had made the heart grow fonder. She was starting to fear too much intimate time in his company would cause her firm demeanor to falter. She suddenly gave her arm a slight pinch. It was one thing if she was alone with the Duke day in and day out, but this was one afternoon. She was making too much out of something that shouldn't be worrisome at all. Nevertheless, when the Duke was announced, she jumped slightly. Miss Stratford raised her eyebrows at her reaction, but said nothing as she turned her attention back to her task. I'll see you later this evening, Iona noted. The lady glanced up with a smile. Have a nice time. Iona was certain that she was about to be sick, but rather than greet Rosewood with a grimace, She forced a smile on her face as she met him in the foyer. He was looking at a random picture, and when she approached, he turned to her with a smile. Ah, Miss Richards, it's nice to see you are punctual at all times, not just when it comes to my gardens. The easy greeting soothed some of her apprehension. Keep your focus on flowers and nothing more, she reminded herself. I have always prided myself on being prompt. He inclined his head and then offered her his arm. She hesitated, wondering if she should accept, but since she didn't wish to be rude, she threaded her arm through his as he escorted her outside. Agatha will be joining us, she added. She's the housemaid. Capital. He inclined his head. By the time Iona was comfortably seated in the familiar vehicle, she saw Agatha exit the house. The Duke spoke a few words to her, and she nodded and climbed up next to the driver as Rosewood joined Iona. She could feel the blood recede from her face. Isn't she riding inside? I told her that a chaperone wasn't necessary since we aren't courting, and she mentioned how she appreciates the fresh air. He winked at her as he shut the door, and the carriage jerked into motion. He settled himself across from her without a care to be had. Iona wanted to point out that, courting or not, her reputation could be taken into question since they were alone together in the interior, but she decided it was best not to press the issue. She certainly didn't want to sound like a prude, and it wasn't as though the Duke was about to ravish her. Unfortunately, the very image of him doing just that had her cheeks heating by degrees. Are you well? Iona's focus jerked to him. What? He smiled in an easy manner. I asked if you were well. Your cheeks are slightly red. She lifted her hands and pressed them against her face. No, I suppose I'm just a little warm. You should take off your bonnet, he suggested. There's no need to stand on ceremony at the moment. You need to be comfortable. That's impossible with you so close, she thought to herself. But she decided she would do as he advised and remove the offending straw. She reached up to take out the hat pin, but when she attempted to pull the bonnet free, it caught on a stray strand of her hair. It came off with a painful pull that caused a few of the pins that were holding her hair back to break free and ping to the floor of the carriage. As a result, the long length of her hair came tumbling about her shoulders. Oh! Her hand immediately went to her head, as her cheeks went from warm to scalding. She reached out her arm and tried to gather the pins that were rolling just out of her reach at her feet, in a desperate attempt to salvage the embarrassing situation. Could it possibly get any worse? Allow me. The Duke easily gathered the pins in his grasp. She exhaled in relief, but when she glanced up, she found his face just inches from her own. Time instantly stood still as her lips parted in an unconscious invitation.
All You Need is a Duke by Bianca Blythe.
The first rule of being a wallflower was to acquire a superb seat. Margaret Carberry, daughter of the Scottish tycoon of the same surname, and relation of absolutely no aristocrats, was no longer a novice at attending balls. Her mother accepted every invitation. Margaret strolled toward the quietest section of the ballroom, furthest removed from the musicians and dancers, just as she did at every ball. Juliet and Genevieve would be here, and she wove through the horde of partygoers with expertise. Women wore thin white gowns, embellished with pastel ribbons and trimmed with lace, an obvious effort to counter the summer heat. Men flashed strained smiles, discernibly uncomfortable in their complexly tied cravats, jewel-colored waistcoats, and snug tailcoats, the latter a product of a season of feasting. The second rule of being a wallflower was to not interact with anyone. Margaret didn't need to see the expressions of the guests shift when they worried they might need to converse. Though the upper echelon didn't tend toward timidity, few desired to be seen speaking with her.
A Scandal with a Scoundrel by Cecilia Rene.
So, what are you going to read for us? And can you tell us what kind of scene you're going to set up?
Well, I am going to read from A Scandal with a Scoundrel, my July release, a part of the Wicked Widows multi-author compilation. The scene I'm going to set up, it's such a funny scene to me, so I hope it's funny. But the scene I'm going to set up is Winnie and Richard have just finished having some sex. And Richard finds out a thing that Winnie did not tell him about, and he's not happy. And so I'm going to get the end of Winnie's POV and go into Richard's POV, which is just kind of funny to me. And I'm like, can you read sexies? But I'm going to pick it up at the end, so we'll see how it goes.
All right, I'm excited. Take it away.
As she caught her breath, it was then that Winnie noticed she was at the foot of the bed and not the head. How did that happen? Her mask was askew, but still on. She strained it, considering removing it altogether. Why was she hiding from him? Winnie had just had the most intimate experience of her life. She no longer wanted to hide herself from him. Richard rose off the bed, and Winnie could not even move to see where he had gone. He returned momentarily, the bed dipping from his sizable weight as a cool cloth touched her skin, cleaning off the evidence of their activities. Victoria, his voice full of concern, had her turning toward him. Looking down at him, she saw what had him concerned. Proof of her virginity coated his now flaccid member. Oh, Winnie had forgotten about that one minor impediment of hers. Abruptly, she sat up, needing to be out of the room. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, watching as she rose, searching for her gown. It wasn't of importance. She bent down to step into her dress. Not important. I just fucked you like you were a scrumpet. A strumpet. How is that not important to mention? He sat up on the bed, his gray eyes now full of rage. Why does Madame Delacour have a virgin working here? I'm sorry, Richard. Goodbye. Victoria, wait. Where are you going? He asked, rising off the bed. I must go. She turned toward the door, opening it and running out of the room as fast as her legs would allow, with her gown practically falling off her body. Winnie did not stop to see if he was following her. As she noticed the late hours, she saw the other rooms were open, some occupants coming out into the hall. She did not stop to see who they were. She just kept running. It was time for her to return to her life and put the entire ordeal behind her. Now, Richard. Richard tripped over his bare feet as cool air massaged his most intimate body parts. He tried to catch his goddess as she dashed out of the Gretna Green room and down the hall. Offending her was not his intention, but he couldn't help his anger. If only he had known she was pure, he wouldn't have been such a bloody beast. Damn it to hell, he was a fool. That she was unbearably tight for a woman of her chosen profession did nothing to deter him. It never occurred to Richard that she could be a virgin. A virgin! His legs shook beneath him as he walked down the hall. The thought of her sheath around his cock nearly brought him to his knees. In truth, he had never been with a virgin before. Even as an innocent himself, Richard had always been with women of experience. Dear God, man, put that thing away, the Duke of St. Clair exclaimed, waving his hand toward the lower half of Richard's body. Richard looked down, noticing that he was indeed naked as the day he was born. Damn it. He couldn't think. He had to find her, needed to see her again. St. Clair, always a pleasure, Richard grumbled at the other Duke, who was much younger than him, before turning around and walking back down the hall. Ignoring the whistles and the gas of the few occupants exiting their own room, Richard rushed back to the Gretna Green room. He wasn't shy. In fact, Richard was rather proud of his body. A regular amount of exercise, fencing, riding, and on occasion bare-knuckle boxing kept him fit. What in God's teeth are you doing? Hendershot rushed up behind Richard as he entered the room in search of his clothing. I need to find her right now. Have you seen her? She was wearing a red gown and gold mask with flowing blonde hair. Richard rushed out the words, pulling up his breeches and going in search of his shirt and waistcoat. Are you speaking of the woman you were entertaining in the ballroom? The reason you forced me to switch rooms with you? His friend, who was currently free of his own mask, raised an eyebrow at Richard and challenged. You wanted to switch rooms with me. You wanted to switch rooms with me first, if I remember correctly. Not caring for his stockings, which he had discarded from before Victoria entered the room, Richard slipped on his black hessians, marching out into the hall. Where do you think you are going? Hendershot took hold of his arm, stopping him from sprinting down the hall. Release me, Harrison, he said coldly, using his friend's given name, which he never did. Richard could not delay. He had to go find her and take her away from this place. She was his now. Of that, he was absolutely certain.
Charlotte's Control by Maggie Sims.
So Charlotte is the Dowager Countess of Peterborough, and she's a 28-year-old widow. Like I said, starting in this scene, she's just starting. It's towards the beginning of the book. It's the meet cute, and she's just starting to reintegrate into Ton society after mourning her husband. Belle, who you'll hear referenced in this passage, is her best friend, and Charles was her husband. William, the hero, is almost 20, between his second and final year at Oxford, but has had to begin learning the earldom because his father's a drunkard. So they've caught sight of each other in an earlier scene at her first ball back, and both felt an attraction. So he approaches her and their host of this ball for an introduction. The host is her friend, and he's very lax on titles. He's very lax about a lot of things, actually, and introduces her as the Countess of Peterborough rather than the Dowager Countess. His mother, who helps him kind of shadow manage the earldom, asked William to see if the Earl of Peterborough was in attendance and to discuss a parliamentary alliance. So William changes course from the introduction to ask about her husband. She flees to the garden unprepared for that question, and he follows to apologize once he finds out the real situation. And we're joining this scene just after his apology.
Take it away.
William went to speak, but Charlotte raised a hand. My response to your innocent inquiry was unnecessarily harsh, and I apologize. Whilst this is one of my first social events since Charles' passing, I should not have attended if I was not ready to be polite. Lady Peterborough, he held his hand out as though asking to hold hers. Did he not recall formal etiquette? There could be no hand-holding between them. He might not even have learned it yet, given his youth. Well, this she could handle. She glanced down at it, then pointedly back up at his face. Dropping his hand between them, further pinning her skirts, he did not seem to realize that it brushed her thigh. The audacity of the puppy. Straightening her spine an inch, she raised her brows at him. He smiled, leaning in. No apology is needed, to my mind. However, if you feel it necessary, my response is that allowing me to sit and bask in your beauty erases all memories of faux pas from my thoughts. She snorted, ignoring the spurt of pleasure in her chest to shake her head side to side. Oh, please, try that on someone your own age. Had she thought him audacious? Impertinent was more like it. I beg your pardon, my lady. I was being truthful. I could stare at you all night. His hair flopped onto his forehead again as he leaned toward her. Charlotte remained silent, staring at him and trying to ignore the thump of her heart and spurt of heat between her legs. Nor did she want to catalog the pull of his jacket over his muscled shoulder and biceps as he twisted, or the strain of his breeches around powerful thighs. His eyes were deep pools of liquid darkness, his lips plush and parted. He moved his hand on the bench an inch, the pinky pressing against her, then retracting. May I hold your hand, please, Lady Peterborough? The impact radiated down to her toes, curling them in her slippers, and up, tightening her nipples and bringing heat to her cheeks. Oh my, he is potent. She did not answer William, instead turning her head away with another snort. Her skirts loosened, and out of the corner of her eye, she caught his hand lifting toward her. Snap! She smacked his knuckles with her folded fan. Impertinent and audacious, she amended her earlier thoughts. At least she wasn't the only one being inappropriate this evening. Lord Stanton, you do not have permission to touch me. Lady Peterborough, 'tis William, please. He rushed on. You have my apology. Will you please forgive me, please? She gave a small sniff, still fighting with her conscience over Belle's suggestion. Did she dare? His next question answered that. How may I make it up to you? At his words, the devil in her reared its head, overriding her conscience. She'd been lonely this past year and a half. While Belle insisted that she could meet someone who fit her sexually, she was not so sure. The breeze shifted and his scent floated to her. Tempered sweetness of spiced rum with something else she couldn't name after being alone so long. No matter, it was delicious. She tilted her head and ran her gaze up and down his form, her pulse racing. Lingering for a moment on his lap, she licked her lips before forcing herself to continue searching. Her gaze settled on his neck before raising to his face. Remove your cravat. Charlotte, Lady Peterborough, you heard me, and you do not have permission to use my given name. It is Lady Peterborough, or... She sucked in a breath, trying not to pant as she attempted to rein in her inner devil, but it had slipped its lead and was running wild. Mistress P. His eyes bulged and his throat moved on a swallow. He lifted his hands hesitantly to his cravat. Gracious, he was actually following her command. She'd been sure his reaction would be insulted dismissal, or worse, laughter. Another hot wave of arousal washed over her. Undoing the pin and knot, he slid the cravat from around his neck to hold it across his lap. What now, Mistress P? You may make amends by keeping your hands to yourself, and I shall help you do that. Charlotte reached over and slid one end of the necktie through his loose hold. She pulled it from under his hands to his wrists, crossed the two ends, and raised his hands using the linen. He shifted and opened his mouth as though to protest. She glared at him through her lashes. Hold still. With his hands between them, she leaned forward an inch and wrapped the ends under his wrists, around to the top, and under again. As he watched, mouth open, she tied the ends into a loose double knot over the wrapping, well out of reach of his thumbs. It would take him a minute or two to figure out that she had left it loose enough for him to bend one hand and get his fingers to the knot to pick at it. Still amazed at his willingness to sit still for her ministrations, she schooled her features. All of this open-mindedness could simply be lack of maturity. However, she could still take her fun. Before she straightened, her inner devil, she liked to think it had Belle's voice, made her lean in further, closing that gap, to brush her breasts against his knuckles, inhaling his scent again. He jerked. Lady, Mistress P? He asked, his voice a croak. Ah, youth. Just testing that you have learned not to grab people without permission, she smirked. Absolutely, Mistress P, he was gasping. Her inner devil preened. She'd not been allowed out in so long she was enjoying this tiny show of power. Now that you have me at your mercy, what will you do with me? The upward lilt of the question sounded hopeful. Remind you to play with children your own age.
The Sailor Without a Sweetheart by yours truly, Katherine Grant.
So today I am reading a sample of my new book, The Sailor Without a Sweetheart, which came out April 2024. And this is in my Preston series, but it is a persuasion-inspired story. So Nate Preston is a naval captain, and 6 years ago during his training, he fell in love with Amy Lamplugh, and they had plans to marry, but she ultimately backed out. And now they have ended up on the same estate. She's visiting her sister who lives in the dower house, and he is visiting her in-laws. He's a guest as he's awaiting a court-martial. And, neither of them were expecting to see each other ever again. So that is the setup of the book. And I'm going to read a scene from the beginning. They have encountered each other by surprise at a group dinner. And Amy suffers from a chronic illness. And she's so kind of overcome by both her illness and the shock of seeing Nate that she faints. And so this picks up right after she has fainted. Nate leapt to Amy's side before he knew what he was doing. She lay crumpled on the floor just behind her brother-in-law's chair, most of her face and stomach turned down. Thank God for the imported Arabian carpet lining the room, or else Amy's head might have hit hard wood. Nate touched her hand to rouse her. Miss Lamplugh. Already, her eyes were blinking open. A good sign. Nate had known many people, women and men, to faint. It was only when they stayed that way for more than a few seconds that one really had to worry. You fainted, he told her, since in his experience of sailors collapsing, they never believed what had just happened. Are you injured? She blinked at him again. Hazel eyes. Had he ever forgotten? They were that magic color that changed with the light. On summer afternoons, they had always seemed as green as hedgerows. Now they were dark and amber, like seawater in a sandy harbor. She's fine, Mrs. Brumridge, the former Miss Mary, replied from her seat. You mustn't be alarmed, Captain. Lady Olivia had rounded the table by now and crouched on Amy's other side. Have you hit your head, my dear? No, I'm sorry, don't make a fuss. The words came weakly out of her. She was still deathly pale, and her fingers felt like icicles. Nate discovered he was holding onto them like some kind of lovesick husband. He let her go. Perhaps the family's physician can be called. There is no need, Mrs. Brumridge said, her voice growing shrill. This is one of her episodes, that is all. By the time Dr. Beckett arrives, she'll be fresh as a daisy. You really mustn't be concerned, Captain Preston. Was she scolding him because she did not want to pay a physician's fee? Or because she did not want Amy receiving his attention? Miss Mary Lamplugh, after all, must have known about his offer of marriage. Perhaps Amy had even confided in her about their plan to elope. Was the younger sister playing protector because she was afraid Nate had returned to whisk Amy away once and for all? Nate schooled himself to keep indignation from steaming out his ears. She's right, Amy said, but her voice was still soft and weak. I need rest, that's all. She looked like she needed much more than rest. The Amy of 6 years ago had cherubic cheeks and a generous helping of flesh filling out her shoulders, bosom, and, when she had let him catch her in his arms, waist. Nate wouldn't have recognized this Amy if he hadn't committed so much of her to memory, for now she was all skin and bones, as if she had gone a month without rations. In the parlor, Nate had been stricken by how her eyes sank into their sockets and her cheeks hollowed into her jaw. Pair that with how her lips had no color, and was that a tremble in her hand as she reached forward, trying to rise onto her feet? This woman needed far more than a few hours in bed. But, as Mrs. Brumridge made clear, Amy Lamplugh's health was far from Nate's concern. I'll ring a maid and have the blue room freshened up for you, Lady Olivia said, wrapping an arm around Amy to help her stand. Oh no, I'd rather go home. At least her voice was beginning to sound steadier. To the Dower House, I mean. Nate wondered if that really was what she meant. Would she prefer to be at Swanhill House? Or was there somewhere else, someone else, that she longed for but could not speak of? It didn't matter. The family had a course of action with regard to Amy, and it did not include him. Nate was about to return to his seat when she took a step on her own and promptly started crumpling back to the floor. He caught her, because he was a naval captain, and he was standing right next to her, and that was what a gentleman did. Not because he longed to have her in his arms again. Oh, Amy cried, softly, for her voice was going weak once more. Thank you. She was a rag doll backed into his arms. Nate gripped her from behind with one hand on her left elbow and the other arm wrapped tightly around her waist. Gently, he rearranged the two of them so that her feet were solidly on the ground. You had better not walk just yet. Fred will see her back to the Dower House, Mrs. Brumridge said. Then he'll come back for me. Mr. Brumridge, who was still in his seat, turned around with a wince. I should be happy to escort you, of course, Miss Lamplugh. Only I did twist my shoulder last week. This had to be a farce of a family and a farce of a reunion of parted lovers. Nate had no choice but to offer his next words, even though he knew they would make him look overeager. I shall carry Miss Lamplugh, if you could show me the way, Mr. Brumridge. There was a pause, as everyone in the dining room considered the situation. Nate would welcome an objection, if only there were a better way to see Amy back to the Dower House without risking a fall and without requiring her to wait for horses to be hitched to a cart. Amy's hands landed on his, where it sat beneath her ribcage. It was still ice cold, but it was also firm, keeping him there. Thank you, Captain Preston. I do not deserve your kindness, but I will accept it. For a moment, Nate was transported back in time to a sunny afternoon at Swanhill House. They had left Amy's great aunt sitting on a chair by the edge of the lake, and set out around its shore. Under a willow tree they had nestled together, Amy between his legs, her back against his chest and his against the trunk. He had felt every word vibrate through her chest into his. Almost as much as he had wanted to steal a kiss, he had felt the magic of that connection and had yearned for the moment to never end. At the time, he had thought it was the beginning of a lifetime. Now, he knew it was only a memory. He avoided Amy's eyes as he, with the sanction of the rest of the party, lifted her into his arms. Her arms looped around his neck, her head only inches away from his. Her perfume, lavender, filled his nostrils. Above his forearms, he could feel the boning of her short stays along her back. If he looked down, he would not look down. He was a gentleman. Mr. Bremridge walked ahead of them through the house and onto the gravel drive. The night was young, with enough gray twilight that the lantern Bremridge carried was hardly necessary. "It is a quarter of an hour's walk, perhaps," Bremridge said. We'll be back before pudding." As if Nate was concerned about missing a meal. "Mrs. Bremridge has the right of it, hasn't she, Amy?" the man continued. "These spells come on every now and then, and after a bit of rest, you're in the best of health again. Overexcitement, the physician supposes, which works differently on each person." That is true. The physicians do not have an explanation. Amy adjusted her grip on Nate, her bare fingers brushing against the nape of his neck. He refused to acknowledge his body's reaction to that. "A bit of egg on your face, eh?" Bremridge said, turning over his shoulder to smile at his sister-in-law. "Fainting in the middle of a party like that?" That was too much to be borne. Nate felt Amy shrink in his arms, though she had enough strength to keep her chin held high, even with the angle he carried her at. He spoke before she could. "I've seen men faint at far worse times. Once, when we were in negotiations with the King of Dahomey, my lieutenant collapsed the very moment the king arrived." Without meaning to, he glanced at Amy. She watched him with wide, solemn eyes. "What a fascinating life you have led." A life she had chosen not to be a part of. Nate looked straight ahead at the path. He had recovered from her rejection years ago. There was no reason to feel it sting again now. They turned off the gravel drive onto a path of packed earth and grass. "Just a little bit farther now," Mr. Bremridge promised. "Need you a rest, Captain Preston?" No. He had carried heavier things longer distances, but there was no polite way to comment on Amy's weight, especially when it seemed linked to whatever unexplainable episode she was suffering from. He redirected the question. "Have you need of a rest, Miss Lamplugh?" "No." She readjusted her arm again, so that her elbow clung more tightly around his neck. Her head was that much closer. For just him to hear, she added, "I am quite comfortable." His body reacted in two halves. Joy, like sinking into a hot bath after days without a wash. For there was a part of him that had longed these 6 years to know that he could carry Amy in his arms and she would be comfortable, that she would hold on to him and not demand to be put down. Pain, like catching the splinters of a broken mast in his back. Because he had wanted this, had offered this, had been ready to risk his career and name and wealth for just this, Amy in his arms for the rest of his life. And she hadn't even had the decency to explain to his face why she would not marry him, had instead left him with a letter to memorize and twist into 1,000 interpretations. "Know that I love you, and if circumstances were different, I would marry you in the very next heartbeat. You must forget me now as you go forth on your destiny. I shall look forward for your name in the newspapers, to hear what a fine, heroic naval officer you become. One day, I hope to read that you are married, too, and raising a family full of boys who will join you in defending goodness from the evils of the world." A good thing they were within sight of the dower house. It loomed ahead of them in the dark, brightened only by a few windows where lanterns stood in wait. Bremridge led them through the front door. Navigating the stairs with Amy in his arms was a bit of a challenge. Nate angled himself on a diagonal, so that neither Amy's head nor her feet would hit the wall or banister. She tried to help by ducking her chin, her ear landing on his shoulder. Perhaps she didn't consider how much that felt like a lover's embrace. "This is Miss Lamplew's chamber," Bremer said, his words oscillating as they all realized together what an awkward thing it was for Nate to carry her directly to her bed. In those months that Nate had courted Amy, he had never so much as reached the same corridor as her room. He had never been able to fantasize about her in the specific decor of that Swan Hill bedroom, though he had certainly imagined her in his bed plenty of times. And now he lay her directly on a mattress. He watched her relax against a pillow, her lips spread in a small smile. He saw her legs stretch out, spotted the white silk stockings protecting her ankles from the evening air. It would be so easy to fall beside her onto the bed, to keep her in his arms, to kiss her once more with that senseless abandon that had so enchanted him 6 years ago. But Nate didn't want that. The desire he felt wasn't even real. It was a memory of a younger self that had loved a younger Amy. He didn't know this Amy, she who was a dutiful sister and obedient daughter, and she certainly didn't know him. He was just a stranger, straightening from her bed after doing her a kind deed. "I hope to find you in better health the next time our paths cross, Miss Lamplugh," he said. With a final nod, he took his leave of her.
I hope you enjoyed these story samples. Hear a new story and interview every week on the Historical Romance Sampler podcast. Just make sure you subscribe so you get the episodes directly in your feed. I'll be back on August 7th with a fresh new episode with best-selling author Elizabeth Everett. Until then, happy reading!